Okay, thank you. I am also with the P&W Research Station in Seattle. I am a research social scientist and team leader for the Urban Wildland Interactions team, the same team that Leah's on. And it's interesting that Cheryl and I have a slightly different memory of how this topic came about. And I was telling Bruce about this at break too. I've never spoken about this aloud or in public, so if it all goes south, I'll blame Cheryl. We were talking about collaboration and how the regional office is supporting it, and they're pushing it, and they're getting it from the Washington office as well. And I happen to mention that it's surprising to me because essentially what collaboration is about is sharing power. And proceeded to give a couple of examples, and Cheryl said, "That's what I want you to talk about." So I am going to, if it would, okay. So, so what I put together, now this is a kind of a thought piece as well as based on some research and history and my history with the agency, which has only been 6 years, but also research I did before that while I was at Utah State University. And I'm a strong supporter of collaboration and what collaboration stands for, and not only a push from the regional office, but it's in virtually all of your, all of the documents and initiatives you have today. The strategic plan talks about partnerships. Planning rule has partnerships and collaboration. The roads rule requires collaboration, and the CFLRPs and recreation sustainability framework talks about partnerships and collaboration. And so the issue becomes, what is collaboration? And so the key elements out of the literature I've got next. It's ongoing process where two or more people or organizations work together to realize shared goals. And the working together part has often been interpreted as joint problem solving. Now, the issue from the standpoint of how does that differ from what public participation was back in the day and coming out of NEPA and doing input and using that input in a planning process, maybe doing workshops and hearing from the public and then taking the input and using it in a plan, it's a significantly different animal because it's joint problem solving. That means constant, ongoing, interactive, working with your stakeholders and using the input. And in my mind, that's two very significant changes from the traditional Forest Service approach to management. One is we have a history of a top-down, very authoritative, hierarchical style of decision-making. And sharing decisions and sharing decision space can be a very difficult and a controversial topic. And the other aspect is that collaboration is more of a political activity than a science research-based activity. In the Forest Service, and part of staking out the terrain claim to make us a superstar agency was the use of research, science, empirical, and now we're basically saying we need to be working more with the public, and that includes things like emotions, and it means stakeholder interactions, and it means more bottom-up kind of decision-making processes. What does that mean for us in terms of actually doing collaboration, and how does power sharing and the implications of needing to share power with the public come into play? Now, before I go on very much farther, Cheryl was actually telling you the truth, and that what I did say I wanted to talk about was the notion of informal power sharing. I'm not talking about changing decision authority or lines of authority, or where Meg just becomes one of 40 people that has an equal say. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is that there are many, many, many different ways of sharing power informally and throughout processes. But we need to make that distinction and understand when and where we can do that in order to be truly working in a collaborative fashion. So what I want to do is do two things. I would like to give you a case study that I like to call a tale of two road plans. compare a roading plan that was done in the Dixie National Forest with one that was done on the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And the Dixie heavily invested in collaboration, and the National Monument did not. And the outcomes were very distinctly different as a result. And then I want to talk about some of the lessons for collaboration, including the need to understand this. What do we mean by shared goals? And recognizing that those shared goals are often conflicts. And we have to figure out how to be finding the common ground and working towards conflicts, because to not deal with the issues and to deal with the conflicts throughout a process can simply exacerbate them in the long run. Joint problem solving requires power sharing, different form of leadership than the 60s, 70s, and 80s when it was a superstar agency. And then if we have time, I'd like to talk some about revisiting the ecosystem management triple bottom line that I think is migrating out of, possibly out of practicality. But again, this is a thought piece, folks. So the first, what I wanted to do first was talk about two case studies. And the Duck Creek Swains Access Management Plan, which they did around 2004, is right up just as the planning, the travel management rule was coming out. And so they presented it as a prototype for travel management rule. The Dixie National Forest is in central Utah, halfway between Salt Lake City and Las Vegas, Nevada. The Dixie, or the Cedar City Ranger District, gets a huge amount of use, very popular from folks both Salt Lake City and Las Vegas, and it has a lot of growth, a lot of second home development, a lot of off-road vehicle travel, and trails and routes. It's also in the middle of RS 2477 issues, the county rights to travelways and to roads, and the counties politically push that in order to keep the land management agencies from closing roads or closing routes. And the Dixie is also in the same region as the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with the National Monument. It was 1996, designated by Clinton as he was leaving office. It was the very first one he designated. It was the most controversial one that he designated, and they got a ton of money as a result to do planning and to do planning well. So to cut to the quick of the story, the Dixie did an excellent job of collaborating with the public and collaborating with their stakeholders, primarily because the Grand Staircase became so embroiled in anti-road sentiment and activities and conflicts and lawsuits that they ended up doing an extremely well-organized and designed collaborative process. So this is what they call the proliferation of unplanned routes on the Dixie. Just give you some examples of what's going on down there, and the climate and ecosystem as well. They had on the Cedar City Ranger District about 6 square miles, 6 miles of road per square mile in a forest plan called for the 2.2. A lot of user-created routes, a lot of legacy roads from logging and other resource access uses. And as I mentioned, it's very close to the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. As the National Monument proceeded to essentially close 1,200 miles of roads without any targeted input related to the roads or road management plan, the state and the counties took them to court, and there were headlines in the newspapers and nasty editorials and the whole thing that I know a lot of you folks have experienced. The folks on the Dixie literally, in their own words, said, "We got scared. We got scared, did not want the same thing happening to us." And what they ended up doing was implementing a process where literally they had GPSed and did a really nice GIS map of all their routes, and they produced a good map that people could see and could identify the roads and the routes and where they went and where they went off to. They also identified resource impact issues and areas throughout And then they essentially did a public engagement and iterative mapping process where literally they took those maps, they rolled them up and put them under their arms and went from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. Rolled them out, asked people where you're special. It actually was the inspiration for some of the work that Lee's doing on the Olympic now. Where are your destinations? How do you get there? What roads do you take? What roads do you need to be taken? They targeted groups that were protesting the Grand Staircase. And the Grand Staircase, we're not talking radical extremists here. The Grand Staircase had signs being pulled up by county commissioners and one of the sheriffs in the local community. The county commissioners organized an effort to go and re-sign the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And they literally went to Mark Habershaw, who was the county commissioner, and the sheriff of Kanab, whose name is now escaping me, and others, put the maps down and said, what do you see as a system and as a designated system on the forest? And they ended up, that took about an extra year. I'm not sure how long it took to map all the routes, but it took about a year to year and a half to get the input and to develop the plan. And the first year, and part of the genius behind what they did was the first year, and the purpose of the travel management plan was to designate a system, not to close roads. And that's such a hugely important distinction in terms of shared values and shared goals. So what they did the first year was they designated the system. They actually added, they took care of the problem environmental areas. They actually added some new segments and produced some color-coded maps that everybody could see. They could find their way around really well and put in 500 signs, and you can see. So the Duck Swains and Swains Creeks are down in the lower where you see the green, yellow, and red lines. So they put in over 500 signs. They extended it to the entire ranger district, and then in anticipation of Secretary Vilsack's all lands approach, they also hooked it to state routes, the market gun ATV system. Then in year 2, they went in and started closing their routes that weren't on the designated system. And literally, when I say iterative process, they went to some groups where they rolled it out and said, okay, here's what we heard, here's what we could do, this is what we've come up next. By about the 3rd or 4th iteration, people were saying, you got it. You don't need to come back anymore. And when they started closing the routes, they ended up closing 60% of the routes. And the Grand Staircase, 1,200 miles of route closure was only 50% of the routes. The forest supervisor's one dictate to them was she wanted to see the routes go from about 6 miles per square mile down to the forest plan standard, which was 2.2. And they got it down to 2.4 square miles. Had no appeals or litigation, and she said, that's good. You're done good. There were no appeals or litigations. The Grand Staircase opponents, some of them, because they're politicians, became some of the strongest proponents for the Dixie Plan. Mark Habershaw actually took out a full-page ad in the Dixie and I think either Salt Lake or Las Vegas newspapers supporting the plan, talking about the process, and how the Dixie was listening and paying attention, and that they wanted to see the plan supported. So they expanded it to perhaps one of the most interesting outcomes of the whole thing was that because they were working collaboratively and the stakeholders had a vested interest, they did joint applications for funding to implement the project. So the district obtained over 2 years, I can't remember the exact amount, but it was about $225,000 in grants that essentially paid for the whole project. But the first set of grants from the state and the counties went to designating the system, because that was the purpose of what they were doing. They were designating a system. They weren't out there to close roads. ostensibly, they were designating a system. So those 4 bullets there are what they did during the first year with the first 100,000 or so, and then the second year they used the funding to go in and close some of the routes. The final result was resources were protected. Visitors were much happier and better served because of the map, because they knew where they were going. Turns out one of the biggest confusions was people were getting lost on the forest. They knew they wanted to get to that ridge, and they thought, well, maybe this is the route to get there, and then they're going down through streams and along stream beds and then up another ridge. And so it actually led to much social benefits as well, and then it became economically feasible because they all worked together to get grants from the states. States and counties, and so that's their propaganda slide of what some of the funding from the state and counties went towards in terms of the implementation. So I've used this as a classic example of actually meeting the ecosystem management goals, the triple bottom line of ecological sustainability, social acceptability, and economic feasibility. It met them all, and it was a recreation roads related project, and collaboration was the key to getting it implemented. I would also argue it's a restoration project. The grand staircase outcome, I just found out a couple of weeks ago that the last lawsuit was settled in 2009. I'm not 100% sure that they're actually implementing the roads plan because I can't find anything online or on the grand staircase project. So I don't know if they're actually implementing the grand staircase road plan or not. But the issue is still contentious, and you can still get on Salt Lake City newspaper, the Deseret News, and it still makes headlines anytime somebody in the grand staircase makes recommendations related to roads. And there's a lot of other issues that are equally contentious, and in fact more so on the National Monument. I had a graduate student a couple years ago who did a thesis, and she wanted to understand the extent to which visitors were or stakeholders, participants were satisfied with the 2 processes, and so she did in-depth interviews and a little bit of quantitative information from 27 participants, and she broke them into folks who were only active on the Dixie, only active on the grand staircase, and those in their attitudes towards that were active on both the Dixie and the grand staircase, and how satisfied they were with process, outcome, and implementation. So the folks who participated only on the Dixie, the scale is 1 very, very dissatisfied or very low to 5 very high. So it's very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And you can see folks who only were involved in the Dixie uniformly satisfied with process, with outcome, and with implementation. Folks that were only involved in the grand staircase, significantly lower satisfaction values in the low to medium range. Folks that were involved in both processes brought the Dixie satisfaction ratings down a little bit, 3 to 4 range, so in the approaching high satisfaction, but primarily medium to high. And then that's folks that were involved in both and what their satisfaction ratings were. And those are some of the worst. Now, granted, there's only about 10 people in each category, but those are some of the worst satisfaction ratings that I've ever seen. So they were all right down in the lower level. So this, it dawned on me through time. This has taken me back to my first project as a graduate student out of Michigan. I did a study of 6 national forests and how they dealt with public involvement during the planning process. And I basically identified 2 different kinds of forests. Those that sort of planned for a long time, internally, met with some people occasionally. There should be a little bump here. This is conflict on this axis. Met with folks a little bit at the scoping stage, and I should have had scoping on there. And then they didn't do anything. They come out with a plan, and conflict skyrocketed, and emerged, and it went up, and then they frantically worked with a few of the folks that they could between the draft and final, and then the final came out, and they're up here on the conflict versus the three of the forests I visited that had very low conflict. They tended to work with issues all throughout the planning process. So they were, and what I told the director of planning was the key was they were using the public involvement throughout. They were meeting with folks, and they were meeting with groups, and they were meeting with the stakeholders, but they were also using it in developing planning alternatives. And it dawned on me, this goes back to 1990, I first came out of graduate school. It dawned on me the grand staircase absolutely took that route, and the Dixie significantly less. And I didn't try to draw these so that it would, to argue that you have less conflict if you dealt with it along, or if you had more. I tried to make them with a similar amount of area underneath. I don't think that's what's important. What's important are the relationships and the decision making and the interaction and the stakeholder buy-in and all the other things that come with collaboration that go on along here, so that when you come out with the final, there's a lot fewer issues to have to deal with, fewer surprises, and there's a lot of a lower level of conflict going out into the next issue or into the future. And that was something that I've sort of developed this graph through the years. I had told the director of planning dealing with and using input and letting it have a real impact was critical. The leaders on the forest who supported doing that were the ones that ended up with a lot lower levels of conflict at the end of the planning process. But what dawned on me through the years of teaching this stuff was that it was more than just about a planning process. Because what ends up happening is if you've got a high level of conflict here, that goes into your neck. That level of conflict goes into that issue as it gets extended into the future. And issues don't just stop; they're ongoing. In fact, I used to tell my students I'd flunk them if they used the term conflict resolution, because that implies you could end it, and management was better term, and that inherently there's the need to share power in joint problem solving, listening, using, and responding throughout, and that's what I refer to as an iterative approach to public involvement then. But it's dawned on me that is what is the distinctive characteristic of collaboration compared to traditional methods of public involvement. The other thing that it really taught me, and Bruce brought this home really well in his presentation, is that this forest versus that forest, the trust level is going to be much higher as you're dealing with the issues and you're dealing with conflict over time, and you have the personal interaction, and they know that they can come and get transparent decision processes and all the stuff that Bruce was talking about. The trust level is going to be much higher on a forest like that. And so there's a paradox here that if you share power up front, if you're sharing power in this stage of an issue, and if there's this interaction and you're sharing power in the short run, you may be giving up some percent, 5, 10, 15% of decision authority, or power, I'm sorry, not decision authority, but giving up some, a percent of. But in the long run, as trust is built up with your publics, you're more likely to retain decision discretion into the future because they trust you. And they know that you'll work with them, or that they can have an input, or they can go to you instead of the newspaper to say, I don't like that road being closed. And so they're more likely to come to Cheryl and say, Cheryl, who do we talk to? It's a paradox, because if you're sharing power in the short run, but then the relationships are being built up over time, then in the long run, you're more likely to share, more likely to retain decision authority, because you're less likely to be in court, less likely to be appealed, less likely to be on the front page of the newspaper or the op-ed pages of the newspaper, where more attention and more constraints are likely to emerge. Okay, so one of the things that it taught me was that when you're dealing with issues, and I've seen people avoid conflicts in public issues so often, issues mean addressing conflicts. And that means how they get framed to show shared ownership or shared goals is so critical. And so I use the example of roads. And for a while, the travel management for the Forest Service is coming out with a minimum roads approach that just smacks of road closure. We're out there to close roads versus designating a system. And part of the designating the system, this is what Lee is dealing with on the Mount Baker, means we've only got enough money for 20 to 30% of the roads. What are we going to designate? It's taking the road closure model and it's flipping it 180 degrees so that there are shared values involved. Recreationists, OHVers see the value. Environmentalists see the value of keeping people on a road system, which is how the Dixie got tremendous support by environmentalists. They were keeping people on the road. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is shut down a road. If people are going to find another way to get there, it could be through the streams or up a hillside, or it could actually, without an analysis and without hearing from the stakeholders, it could actually exacerbate the environmental factors. And doing that is difficult. How you define and frame those issues is difficult, and it can be counterintuitive. So, and then power sharing. This list on the top is sort of the traditional, go from just informing people all the way down to giving them decision power or empowerment. Informing, consultation where you get feedback. Collaboration is the notion of working with partners to develop alternatives and make decisions. And empowerment is where you turn over decision authority. And clearly, we're not in that, that tends to be rare, I would guess, tribal interaction issues or land trust collaborations. But generally, we need to be thinking about what it means to partner with others to make decisions, and also the extent of the collaboration is not just necessarily a planning or a final decision, but also stewardship and implementation. That's what they're doing on the Dixie, working with the partners and stakeholders to actually implement the project as well. And then co-management. I've been smacked down for using the term co-management because that does imply turning over formal decision authority, which is you can't, which is clearly capital P power, which is the final power sharing issue that I wanted to address. I know that with all lands approach, I know that with tribal interactions, there are times when sharing formal decision authority becomes possible, but that's clearly rare. What we're talking about and what I'm trying to basically argue is figuring out the ways, and I have to give Claire Ryan, a colleague in the forest policy at Utah, or at University of Washington, credit for the uppercase P and the lowercase p. Talking about informal power sharing, how that gets done throughout a process. It can be as simple as active listening and responding to people's points. Decision makers attending meetings, using the input to actually generate alternatives, but then going back and showing how those alternatives were used, how the input was used, how the alternatives reflect. So it's an interactive process. Providing staff support and budget to go out and do this crazy stuff called collaboration. Bruce, of course, gave you a whole nother, in his big long lists, I could read several of them and pick out, oh, that's kind of a way of sharing power there, and this one is, and this one is. There's a whole bunch of them. He talked about being transparent and open, being genuine and honest. When we first started meeting with the Mount Baker, they said, well, we've got to go and tell them we're closing all the roads. And so we worked at least half of one meeting just talking about how the message of here's the funding we've got available. And based on current costs of the road system, it means we may be looking back at cutting back 75%, 60 or 75%, but there can be other alternatives. People can partner and work in partnership to keep up some of the roads or some of the loops. There are a number of different ways of working in partnership, and in joint problem solving to address some of the issues that may emerge. And I need to let you go to lunch. So I guess the distinction there becomes that level of power sharing is also passed down from line officers to staff to staff to stakeholders, and that's not an easy relationship. And it's one that needs to be thought through, depending on the issue, the type of issue, and the extent. But it needs to be thought through, I think, in terms of we're working with the public and sharing this decision space. What is that going to look like? So I probably should finish up here quickly. I just wanted to, in terms of leaders and what it means for leadership, I got this off of the web because I was wondering myself. So I went to Wikipedia, this is what happens when Cheryl says, yeah, talk about that. And I said, I never talked about this before. But collaborative leaders have to be taking more risks because there's not the direct reward payoff line. And that's true of staff as well. You know, you can't necessarily report to Congress on what the final outcomes or products are as well. They need to be passionate about resources and people and able to share knowledge, power, and credit. And that's why I put this one in, is the notion that collaborative leadership means willingness to share knowledge, power, and credit. And that quote there I literally got off the web. Traditional management based on giving potential managers a team of people and a set of resources, and success is rewarded with more resources and control. You meet your targets, you get more people, you get more resources. Collaboration requires managers to achieve success through people and resources outside their control. And for this, they have no preparation. It's a different, it's a different cultural expectation. It's different than our training in natural resources. I taught natural resources for 16 years. Different than any of the training that's given. It's a different activity, but I do think it's one that is literally increasing in importance in the future. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. I just had the notion of how we blend this with ecosystem management, but that's probably another half an hour, so I'll leave that off the table. But I wanted to leave you with the idea of power sharing, informal power sharing, and at its heart, that's what collaboration means. Okay?